My husband took everything from me and waited for me to shatter like cheap glass. 37 days passed. I never called once. When he finally drove past my house and saw the survey markers planted in my front yard, the color drained from his face so fast I thought he might crash into the mailbox. But let me tell you how this all started. I was standing in the express checkout lane at Morrison's Market with 12 items carefully arranged in my basket. I had chosen each one with precision: the store-brand pasta, the marked-down vegetables, the generic pain reliever, the chicken thighs on manager's special. Because even though there was money in that account, even though Daniel always said we were comfortable, I never stopped being the woman who learned to make $40 stretch across an entire week. I placed my items on the belt. The cashier, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, scanned each one with mechanical efficiency. Beep, beep, beep. $26.73, she said, barely making eye contact. I inserted my card into the reader. I waited. The machine made a harsh buzzing sound that seemed to echo through the entire store. Declined. The cashier frowned. "Try again, honey." I did. My hands were steady. I had done this 1,000 times. Declined. Heat crept up my neck. Behind me, I heard a man shift his weight impatiently. A woman sighed, one of those long, theatrical sighs designed to make sure I knew I was wasting her time. The cashier's expression shifted to something worse than annoyance. Pity, that soft, apologetic look that said, "I feel sorry for you, but I also need you to move along." "Do you have another card?" she asked quietly, as if lowering her voice would somehow preserve my dignity. "No," I whispered. "No, let me call my bank." But even as I said it, I knew. Deep in my gut, beneath the confusion and the rising panic, I knew. "I'll have to void this transaction," the cashier said, already reaching for my items. I nodded. My throat was too tight to speak. I walked out of that store with my head up but my hands shaking, leaving behind 12 items I needed and couldn't buy. I arrived home in a fog, not crying. Something about the shock kept the tears locked behind my ribs. I dropped my purse on the kitchen counter and pulled out my phone. The banking app opened smoothly. I entered my username and password, the same ones I'd used for 3 years. Error: username or password incorrect. I tried again. Same result. My pulse hammered in my ears as I dialed the bank's customer service line. The automated voice walked me through verification: account number, social security number, mother's maiden name. After 8 minutes of hold music, a young woman's voice came through, professional and detached. "Mrs. Carver, I see here that your access permissions were modified by the primary account holder on September 14th. My breath stopped. Modified how? Only the primary account holder can authorize transactions or access account details at this time. You would need to contact Mr. Carver to restore your permissions." Daniel, my husband Daniel, who had suggested 4 years ago that we consolidate everything under his name for estate planning purposes, who had convinced me it would be simpler, cleaner, more efficient, who had looked me in the eyes and said, "I would never do anything to hurt you. You know that." How naive I had been. How breathtakingly stupid. I hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen of the house we had shared for 12 years. The house I had helped furnish, had painted, had poured myself into. I looked at the refrigerator covered in mundane reminders: dentist appointments, grocery lists, a faded wedding photo held up by a magnet shaped like a lighthouse. I thought about calling him. My thumb hovered over his contact. Daniel's face smiled up at me from the screen, a photo from our anniversary dinner 2 years ago, back when I still believed in the performance of our happiness. I almost pressed call. I almost asked him what had happened, demanded an explanation, pleaded with him to tell me this was some kind of terrible mistake. But something stopped me, something small and hard, like a pebble lodged in my chest, because this wasn't a mistake. Daniel knew exactly what he had done. He had locked me out deliberately, strategically. He was waiting for me to panic, waiting for me to come running, desperate and humiliated, begging him to fix what he had broken on purpose. He wanted me powerless. He wanted me dependent. He wanted me on my knees. I put the phone down. I would not give him that satisfaction. Not today. Maybe not ever. I walked to the pantry and opened the door. Inside, half a bag of rice, a can of black beans, a bottle of olive oil, salt, pepper, a box of crackers. Enough to survive for several days if I was careful. I had survived worse than this. I had survived my mother's death when I was 19. I had survived building a small business from nothing, only to watch it collapse during the recession. I had survived the miscarriage that nearly destroyed me, the surgery that left scars across my abdomen, the depression that swallowed 2 years of my life. I had survived every single thing life had thrown at me, and I would survive Daniel too. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of traffic. My mind replayed the last 6 months in excruciating detail, every moment I had ignored, every warning sign I had explained away. The signs had been there. I simply hadn't wanted to see them. The way Daniel had started working late more often, coming home smelling like cologne I hadn't bought him. The way he had begun questioning every purchase I made, every decision, every word that came out of my mouth. The subtle shift in his tone, less partner, more parent. "Are you sure you need that?" he would ask when I bought new shoes. "You're being emotional," he would say when I tried to discuss our budget. "I'm just trying to protect us," he would insist when I questioned why he needed to control everything. I remembered 3 weeks ago when I had asked him about our savings. We were sitting at the kitchen table, and I had mentioned wanting to set aside money for the roof repairs we'd been postponing. Daniel had looked at me with that calm, unshakable expression he wore when he wanted to make me feel irrational. "The finances are handled, Claire. You don't need to worry about it." "I'm not worried," I had said carefully. "I just want to understand where we stand." "You don't trust me?" His voice had gone soft. Wounded, and like an idiot, I had backed down. "Of course I trust you." What a fool I had been. But now, lying in the dark with nothing but clarity and rage to keep me company, I understood. Daniel hadn't just taken my money. He had been preparing to take everything. And he had expected me to crumble quietly, to disappear without a fight, to accept whatever scraps he decided to throw my way. He had miscalculated, because I wasn't the woman he thought I was anymore, and when he finally realized that, it would be far too late. Before we continue, pulse right in the comments which state you are listening from. Also, like and subscribe. Enjoy the story. To understand how I got here, how a marriage that looked stable from the outside became a trap I didn't see closing, I need to take you back 12 years, to the woman I was when I first met Daniel Carver. I was 31, running a small consulting business from a cramped office downtown, working 60-hour weeks, living on coffee and ambition. I had clawed my way out of a difficult childhood and built something that was mine, modest, but mine. I was proud, maybe a little lonely, but proud. Daniel walked into my office on a Thursday afternoon in October, referred by a mutual colleague. He needed help organizing documentation for a property management company he was launching. He wore a pressed button-down shirt, spoke in measured sentences, and had a way of listening that made you feel like every word you said mattered. "You're very thorough," he said after our first meeting, reviewing the systems I'd proposed. That's rare. I remember blushing. Actually blushing, like a teenager. We started dating 3 weeks later. Everyone said I was lucky. Daniel was the kind of man mothers approved of. Steady, employed, respectful. He opened doors. He remembered birthdays. He never raised his voice, never drank too much, never made scenes. After a string of chaotic relationships in my 20s, his calm felt like sanctuary. "You deserve someone who takes care of you," he told me 6 months in, his hand warm against my cheek. And I believed him. We married in a small ceremony 18 months later. No bridesmaids, no elaborate reception, just immediate family and a handful of friends. Daniel said we should save money for our future. It made sense. Everything he said always made sense. The first few years were good, or at least I thought they were good. We fell into routines. Sunday groceries, Friday movie nights, annual beach vacations where we stayed in budget motels and cooked our own meals. I kept my business running, though the hours were grueling. Daniel's company was growing steadily, and he spoke often about building something sustainable for both of us. "We're a team," he would say, kissing my forehead before bed. I wanted to believe we were. The shift happened so gradually I didn't notice it was happening. It started with the joint account. Year 3 of our marriage, Daniel suggested we consolidate our finances. "It's easier this way," he explained one evening over dinner. "No more splitting bills, no more keeping track of who paid for what. Everything in one place." I hesitated. My business account had always been separate, a boundary I'd maintained since my early 20s when an ex-boyfriend had stolen money from me. "What about my business?" I asked. "Keep that separate, of course," Daniel said smoothly. "I'm just talking about household expenses, mortgage, utilities, groceries, the everyday stuff." It sounded reasonable. It sounded like partnership. So I agreed. Within 6 months, Daniel was managing everything. He paid the bills, tracked our spending, made decisions about repairs and purchases. At first, I was relieved. I had more time to focus on my clients, less mental clutter about due dates and account balances. But slowly, so slowly I barely noticed, I stopped having access to the full picture. "How much do we have in savings?" I asked one night. "Enough," Daniel replied, not looking up from his laptop. "Don't worry about it." "I'm not worried. I just want to know." He sighed, one of those patient sighs that made me feel like I was being difficult. "Claire, I handle the finances so you don't have to stress. That's the whole point." I let it go. I let a lot of things go. Year 5, Daniel suggested I scale back my business. We were sitting in the living room, and I had just finished telling him about a new client, a mid-sized firm that wanted a complete records overhaul. It was the biggest contract I'd landed in 2 years, and I was electric with excitement. Daniel listened quietly, then set down his coffee. "That sounds like a lot of work," he said carefully. "It is, but it's good work. And the money? Is it worth the stress?" He interrupted gently. "You've been exhausted lately. I see it. You come home drained, you barely sleep. Maybe it's time to think about slowing down." I stared at him. "Daniel, this is what I do. This is my career." "I know, and I'm so proud of you." He reached for my hand. "But we're stable now. My company is doing well. You don't have to work yourself into the ground anymore. You could take on fewer clients. Maybe focus on the easier projects. Give yourself room to breathe." It sounded like concern. It sounded like love. Looking back now, I can see it for what it was, the beginning of my erasure. But at the time, I was tired. Bone deep, chronically tired, and the idea of less pressure, less chaos, less constant hustle, it was tempting. So I scaled back. I turned down the big contract and kept only my long-term, low-maintenance clients. Daniel smiled when I told him, "See? Doesn't that feel better already?" And for a while, I thought it did. The red flags came in whispers, not shouts, the way Daniel started checking my phone just to see who's calling, the way he questioned my clothing choices. "Are you sure you want to wear that to dinner? It's a bit much, don't you think?" The way he made decisions without consulting me. "I already booked the vacation. I thought you'd be happy." The way he reframed every disagreement as my emotional instability. "You're overreacting again. Why do you always have to be so dramatic?" Each moment, isolated, seemed harmless. Loving, even. He was protecting me. He was helping me. He knew what was best. But together, those moments formed a pattern I refused to see. I stopped voicing opinions, stopped making plans, stopped trusting my own instincts. And Daniel, he never once raised his voice, never once had to, because control, I learned too late, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives wearing the mask of care. By year 10, I barely recognized myself. My business had withered to almost nothing, just 2 remaining clients, both paying minimal retainers. Our finances were entirely in Daniel's name. My signature appeared on documents I didn't remember signing. My voice, once sharp and confident, had become hesitant, apologetic. I had become a guest in my own life, and the worst part, I had helped him do it. I had handed over control piece by piece, believing I was building a partnership when I was actually dismantling myself. Now, lying awake in the dark, after he had cut off my access to everything, I finally understood what I had been too naive, too trusting, too desperate for stability to see before. Daniel had never wanted a partner. He had wanted a project, something he could shape, manage, control. And I had let him. The regret didn't feel like rage. It felt like grief. Heavy, suffocating grief for the woman I used to be, the one who had walked away from that cramped downtown office 12 years ago and never looked back. But grief, I was learning, could be useful. It could sharpen you. It could teach you never to make the same mistake twice. The final 2 years of my marriage didn't collapse in a dramatic explosion. They dissolved slowly, like salt in water, so gradual you don't realize what's happening until you taste the bitterness on your tongue. It began with transportation. Daniel had always driven us to social events, to the grocery store, to family dinners. I had my own car, a 12-year-old Honda I'd bought used, but somewhere along the way he started questioning whether I really needed it. "The insurance is expensive," he mentioned one morning over coffee, "and you barely drive it anymore." "I use it for errands," I said, "which I can handle on my way home from work." His tone was reasonable, practical. "Think about it, Claire. We could save $300 a month." $300. In the fog of financial uncertainty I'd been living in, that number sounded significant. "I guess that makes sense," I heard myself say. 2 weeks later, my Honda was sold. Daniel deposited the money into the account I could no longer access. He promised we'd discuss it later, add it to our savings. We never discussed it. Now, when I needed to go somewhere, I had to ask. And asking meant explaining. Justifying, waiting for approval. "Do you really need to go to the library today?" Daniel would ask, his voice gentle, almost concerned. "I thought you were trying to rest more." Rest. That word became a cage. The isolation crept in through small surgical cuts. My friend Monica called one Saturday, inviting me to lunch. I hadn't seen her in months. She was one of the few people from my old business life I'd managed to stay in touch with. "I'd love to," I told her, genuinely happy. Daniel overheard from the kitchen. He didn't say anything right away, just walked into the living room, leaned against the door frame, and waited for me to hang up. "Monica?" he asked. "Yeah, we're meeting Tuesday for lunch." He nodded slowly, that careful, measured nod that always preceded something unpleasant. "That's nice. I just hope she's not going to stress you out again." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Last time you saw her, you came home exhausted. You said she'd spent the whole time complaining about her divorce, and it drained you." He moved closer, his hand settling on my shoulder. "I'm not saying don't go. I'm just saying, be careful. You're in a fragile place right now." I didn't remember saying that, but Daniel had a way of remembering things I supposedly said, things that sounded true enough to make me doubt myself. "Maybe I should reschedule," I murmured. "That's probably wise," he agreed, squeezing my shoulder affectionately. "You can see her when you're feeling stronger." I canceled with Monica. Then I canceled the next invitation, and the one after that. Eventually, she stopped calling. Daniel began speaking about me to others as if I were fragile, delicate, overwhelmed. At his company's holiday party, one of the last social events I attended, I overheard him talking to a colleague near the bar. "Claire's taking some time to focus on herself," Daniel said, his voice warm with concern. "She's been struggling a bit. Stress, you know. I'm just trying to make sure she has space to heal." Struggling. Healing. As if I were recovering from some unnamed illness. The colleague glanced at me with that same pitying look the grocery store cashier had given me. I felt my face flush with humiliation. Later in the car, I confronted him. "Why did you tell Mark I was struggling?" Daniel's expression remained calm, almost puzzled. "Because you are, Claire. You've said it yourself. You're exhausted, anxious, overwhelmed." I was just being honest. "I never said I was struggling. You didn't have to say it explicitly." His voice softened, as if he were explaining something obvious to a child. "I can see it. The way you've been withdrawing, the mood swings, the forgetfulness. I'm worried about you." Mood swings, forgetfulness, words that made me sound unstable. "I'm not." I started, but my voice faltered. Was I? Had I been? Daniel reached over and took my hand. "It's okay to admit you're not okay. That's the first step." I pulled my hand away and stared out the window for the rest of the drive home, my thoughts tangled in confusion and anger I couldn't quite name. The relocation happened on a Wednesday morning in late spring. Daniel came home from work early, which was unusual. He found me in the kitchen, washing dishes, and stood there watching me with an expression I couldn't read. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about what's best for you." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "You need space, time away from everything. The pressure, the noise, the expectations." He moved closer, his voice dropping to that soothing tone he used when he wanted me to agree without thinking. "I inherited a small property from my aunt 2 years ago, a bungalow on the edge of town. Quiet, peaceful. I think you should stay there for a while." I stared at him. "You want me to move out?" "Not permanently, just temporarily. A few weeks, maybe a month. Give yourself time to reset." He smiled that patient, benevolent smile. "I'll handle everything here. You won't have to worry about anything." "Daniel, I don't need—" "Claire," he interrupted gently. But there was steel beneath the softness. "You're not well. I think we both know that. And I can't help you if you won't help yourself." The words landed like a diagnosis, like a verdict. Not well. I felt my resolve crumble. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was losing my grip. Maybe I did need time away to figure out what was wrong with me. "Okay," I whispered. The bungalow was small, outdated, isolated. Peeling paint, a sagging porch, windows that rattled when the wind blew. It sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by overgrown trees and silence. Daniel helped me move my things: 2 suitcases, a box of books, some kitchen essentials. He set everything inside, looked around with satisfaction, and turned to me. "This is good for you," he said. "You'll see." Then he left, and I stood in that empty, unfamiliar house, listening to the sound of his car fade into the distance, and felt the truth settle over me like a heavy blanket. This wasn't a retreat. This was containment. Daniel hadn't moved me here to help me heal. He had moved me here to hide me, to remove me from view, to park me somewhere out of the way while he continued his life without interference. I walked through the small rooms: bedroom, bathroom, cramped kitchen, living area that smelled faintly of mildew. I opened the pantry and found it empty, except for a bag of rice and a can of soup Daniel must have placed there. I sat down on the worn couch and looked around at the walls of this place I hadn't chosen, in a situation I hadn't agreed to, living a life that no longer felt like mine, and for the first time in years, I felt something other than confusion or exhaustion. I felt clarity. Cold, sharp, unforgiving clarity. Daniel hadn't saved me. He had buried me, and now I was supposed to stay buried, quiet and compliant, until he decided what to do with me next. But sitting there in that silent, suffocating bungalow, I made a decision. I would not stay buried. Not anymore. Daniel called on the 3rd day. I was sitting on the bungalow's back steps, drinking instant coffee from a chipped mug I'd found in the cabinet, when my phone buzzed. His name appeared on the screen, and I felt my heart lurch with that old, conditioned response, the instinct to answer immediately, to reassure him, to be available. I let it ring. He called again that evening, and the next morning, and twice the day after that. I didn't answer once. On day 7, he sent a text. "Just checking in. Hope you're doing okay out there." The casual tone, the false concern, as if he hadn't orchestrated every piece of this. I deleted it without responding. The first week was the hardest. Not because I missed him, I was surprised to discover I didn't, but because survival required constant calculation, and I was working with almost nothing. I had $43 in cash, tucked in my wallet from months ago. The pantry held rice, 1 can of soup, half a jar of peanut butter, and a box of stale crackers. The refrigerator was empty except for a bottle of tap water I'd filled myself. I took inventory like a general assessing an army's rations before a siege. $43. Maybe 10 days of food if I was strategic. I walked 3 miles to the nearest dollar store and bought dried beans, pasta, a jar of tomato sauce, a dozen eggs, the cheapest loaf of bread, instant oatmeal, powdered milk, total $18.47. The cashier didn't look at me with pity this time. I made sure of that. I stood straighter. I counted my cash with steady hands. I said thank you and walked out with my dignity intact. Small victories. I was learning to count them. By the 2nd week, something inside me began to shift. I stopped waiting for rescue, stopped imagining Daniel would suddenly realize what he'd done and come apologize, stopped hoping this was all some terrible misunderstanding that would resolve itself if I just stayed quiet and patient enough. This was intentional. This was calculated. This was the end game of 12 years of systematic dismantling. And once I accepted that, once I let the fantasy of the good husband dissolve completely, I could finally think clearly. I started making lists, not grocery lists, strategy lists. What I knew, what I could prove, what I needed to find out. I opened my laptop, a 4-year-old machine Daniel had let me keep because he considered it obsolete, and began searching through old files, emails I'd forgotten about, contracts I'd signed, bank statements from years ago before Daniel had taken over everything. I worked methodically the way I used to when I ran my consulting business, the way I'd been trained to organize information, track patterns, build cases, and slowly, piece by piece, a picture began to form. Daniel called less frequently as the weeks passed. By week 3, the calls had stopped entirely. He was waiting. I could feel it, even from a distance, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to come crawling back, desperate and defeated, waiting for the moment when I would finally admit I couldn't survive without him. Instead, I gave him silence, and in that silence, I began to rebuild. I reached out to Monica first. It took me 2 days to work up the courage to send the email. I didn't know if she'd even respond after months of canceled plans and ignored messages. Monica, I'm sorry I disappeared. I wasn't in a good place, and I handled it badly. If you're willing, I'd like to explain, and I could use a friend right now. Claire. She responded within an hour. Claire. I've been worried about you. Call me. We spoke for 2 hours. I told her everything, not all at once, but enough. The financial control, the isolation, the relocation to the bungalow, the locked accounts. Monica was quiet for a long time after I finished. Claire, she said finally, her voice tight with anger, that's financial abuse. You know that, right? I hadn't let myself use that word, but hearing someone else say it made something click into place. Yeah, I said quietly. I know. What do you need? That simple question, not judgment, not pity, just what do you need, nearly broke me. Work, I said. Any kind of work. I have to start earning something. Monica didn't hesitate. I'll make some calls. Within 2 weeks, I had 3 small freelance projects. Nothing major. Data organization for a law firm, document indexing for a medical office, records cleanup for a small nonprofit. The kind of unglamorous work I used to do in my sleep, but it was income, money Daniel didn't know about, flowing into an account he couldn't access. I opened it at a bank 2 towns over using my maiden name, deposited every payment immediately, watched the balance grow with a satisfaction that felt almost primal. $220, then $450, then $680. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I began walking every morning, partly because I had no car, partly because I needed to move, to feel my body do something other than sit and worry. 3 miles to the main road, another mile to the small library branch. I spent hours there, using their computers, their Wi-Fi, their quiet rooms, where I could work undisturbed. The librarian, an older woman named Helen, started recognizing me. "You're here every day," she observed one afternoon, not unkindly. "I like the quiet," I said. She nodded, as if that explained everything. Then she handed me a library card. "In case you want to borrow anything, Wi-Fi passwords on the back." I took it with both hands, absurdly grateful. By week 6, I had contacted 4 more former clients. 2 didn't respond. 1 said they'd moved to a different system, but the 4th, a small accounting firm I'd worked with years ago, said they'd been looking for someone exactly like me. "We need help digitizing 7 years of paper records," the office manager explained. "It's tedious work, but it pays $15 an hour. Interested?" "Yes," I said immediately. "Absolutely yes." I started the following Monday. They let me work remotely, sending scanned batches via encrypted file transfer. I worked late into the night, my eyes burning, my back aching, but my bank account steadily growing. $2,200. Then $1,800. Then $2,400. It was the most money I'd controlled in 2 years. Daniel drove past the bungalow once during this time. I was sitting on the front porch, laptop open, working through a spreadsheet. I heard the engine before I saw the car. His silver sedan, slowing down as it approached. He didn't stop, didn't pull into the driveway, just slowed to a crawl, staring at the house as he passed. I looked up. Our eyes met for a brief second. I didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't react at all. Just held his gaze with an expression I hoped conveyed exactly what I was feeling. I am still here. I have not broken, and I am not coming back. Then he drove on. I returned to my spreadsheet, hands steady, heart pounding. That night, I allowed myself to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Not hope, exactly. Hope felt too fragile, too naive. But determination. Cold, clear, unshakable determination. Daniel had tried to erase me. He had stripped away my money, my mobility, my connections, my voice. But he had made one critical miscalculation. He had assumed that without him, I would be nothing. He had forgotten who I was before I met him. And now, alone in that small bungalow with my growing bank account and my quiet, methodical plans, I was remembering, too, the woman I used to be. The woman who had built something from nothing once before. The woman who could do it again. It started with a folder I'd forgotten existed. I was cleaning out my laptop one evening, deleting old files to free up space, when I found a backup folder labeled Business Archive 2013-2018. I almost deleted it without opening. What use were 5-year-old business records now? But something made me pause. I clicked it open. Inside were hundreds of files. Client contracts, email threads, financial statements from when I still had my consulting business. And buried near the bottom, a subfolder titled Personal Joint Docs. I opened it. My breath caught. There were documents I didn't remember saving. PDFs of forms Daniel had asked me to sign over the years. Mortgage refinancing papers. Investment account applications. A deed transfer for property. I vaguely recalled him mentioning once. I started reading. The mortgage refinance from 2019. I remembered signing it. Daniel had explained we were getting a better interest rate, saving money each month. I'd trusted him. Signed where he indicated, barely read the fine print. But now, reading it carefully, I saw something I'd missed. The refinance had pulled $47,000 in equity out of our home. Money that should have gone into our joint account. I searched my email for any mention of that $47,000. Nothing. I checked old bank statements I'd saved from that period. No deposit, no transfer, no trace of nearly $50,000. My hands started trembling. I opened the next document, an investment account application from 2020. I remembered this one too. Daniel had been excited about it. Said we were finally in a position to start investing for retirement. He'd asked me to sign as a joint account holder. "We're building our future," he'd said, kissing my forehead. But reading the actual document now, I saw the account wasn't joint. It was in his name only. My signature appeared at the bottom. I recognized it, remembered signing, but the account designation clearly stated individual account. Primary owner, Daniel Carver. Why would he need my signature for an individual account? Unless... My stomach dropped. Unless my signature had been used to authorize the transfer of funds from our joint account into his individual account. I spent the next 3 hours going through every document in that folder. a property deed transfer from 2018. Daniel had inherited land from his aunt. He told me that much. But according to this document, the land had been transferred into a family trust, with him as the sole trustee and beneficiary. My name appeared nowhere on it, except at the bottom, my signature, dated and notarized. Why would I have signed off on a trust I wasn't part of? I opened my email archive and searched for trust and inheritance and aunt. I found an email from Daniel, sent in September 2018. Claire, I need you to sign some paperwork for Aunt Linda's estate. Just formalities, tax documents mostly. I'll leave them on the kitchen table. Tax documents, not a trust, not a property transfer that would lock assets solely under his control. Tax documents. My heart was pounding now, my mind racing through years of signatures, agreements, forms I'd signed without reading because I trusted him, because he'd told me they were routine, because questioning him felt like not trusting our marriage. I pulled up our joint bank statements from 2017 through 2021, the years before Daniel had locked me out completely. I started tracking large withdrawals and transfers. March 2017, $12,000 transfer out. Labeled home improvement. July 2018, $8,500 withdrawal. Labeled medical. November 2019, $15,000 transfer. Labeled investment. January 2021, $22,000 withdrawal. Labeled vehicle purchase. I cross-referenced these against my emails, my calendar, my memories. We never did $12,000 in home improvements in 2017. I would have remembered that. There were no medical expenses in 2018 that cost $8,500. We'd both been healthy that year. The November 2019 investment had supposedly been into our joint retirement fund, but I just looked at that fund's opening documents. It was individual, not joint. And the vehicle purchase? We'd bought Daniel's current car in 2020, and it had cost $18,000, not $22,000. So where had the extra $4,000 gone? Where had any of it gone? I made a spreadsheet. 3 columns: date, amount, official label, actual verification. I went back 5 years, tracking every significant transaction I could find. By midnight, the pattern was undeniable. Over $127,000 had been moved out of our accounts over 5 years. Transferred, withdrawn, redirected, always with official-sounding labels, always with my presumed consent. But none of it had gone where Daniel said it went. I found the most damning evidence at 2:00 a.m., my eyes burning from screen glare. An email thread from 2020 between Daniel and someone named Steve Dale. The subject line, Asset Restructuring Consultation. I didn't recognize the name, but the content made my blood run cold. Daniel's email, I need to move approximately $85,000 in joint assets into protected accounts before the year ends. What's the cleanest approach that minimizes tax exposure and maintains access flexibility? Stephen's response: if your spouse has already signed authorizations for account management, you can establish individual investment vehicles and transfer funds with minimal documentation requirements. I'd recommend a combination of... The thread went on for 6 more emails. Technical, strategic, calculated. Daniel hadn't accidentally taken control of our finances. He had planned it, consulted professionals, executed a strategy, used my signatures, obtained through misdirection and lies, to legitimize transfers I never understood or agreed to. I sat back, my laptop screen glowing in the darkness of the bungalow. This wasn't marital conflict. This wasn't even just financial abuse. This was fraud, potential forgery, definitely misrepresentation, possibly outright theft. I thought about the deed I'd signed, thinking it was for tax purposes. the investment accounts I'd authorized, believing they were joint, the refinance I'd approved, trusting the money would benefit us both. Every signature had been obtained through deception. And Daniel, calm, methodical, careful Daniel, had documented all of it. He'd been so confident I would never look, so certain I would never question, so sure I was too trusting, too compliant, too beaten down to ever investigate. He'd underestimated me. I pulled out a notebook, an actual paper notebook, because somehow this felt too important to trust to digital files alone, and began making notes. Documents I had, documents I needed, questions to ask, people to contact. I wasn't angry anymore. I was clear. This wasn't about saving a marriage. This wasn't about winning an argument or proving a point. This was about justice. Legal, documented, undeniable justice. At 3:00 a.m., I sent an email to Monica. I need a lawyer, a good one. Someone who handles financial fraud and asset concealment. Can you help? She responded at 7:00 a.m. I know someone. She's a shark. I'll send you her contact info. By noon, I had a consultation scheduled for the following week. I spent the next 5 days gathering everything I could find, printing documents, organizing emails, building a timeline, creating a comprehensive file that showed not just what Daniel had done, but how systematically he had done it. Every forged authorization, every misleading label, every strategic transfer. I worked with the precision I used to bring to my consulting jobs. The skills Daniel had convinced me to abandon, the expertise he'd told me I didn't need anymore. But I had needed it. I needed it now more than ever. On the 6th day, I sat on the bungalow's porch with a folder 3 inches thick. Inside was everything, the proof, the patterns, the paper trail Daniel had never expected me to find. I thought about calling him, confronting him, demanding an explanation, but I didn't, because this was no longer personal, this was legal, and Daniel was about to discover that the woman he'd tried to erase knew exactly how to build an airtight case. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a process server who looked uncomfortable standing on my sagging porch. Claire Carver? He asked, though he clearly already knew. Yes. He handed me the manila envelope. You've been served. I took it with steady hands, thanked him, and closed the door. Inside, I sat at the small kitchen table and opened the envelope carefully, as if it contained something fragile rather than the formal dismantling of 12 years. Petition for dissolution of marriage. I read through it slowly, methodically, the way I'd learned to read contracts back when I still had a business. Daniel was filing for divorce. No surprise there. But it was the specific claims that made my jaw tighten. According to the petition, I was financially dependent, emotionally unstable, unable to manage my own affairs. Respondent has demonstrated ongoing mental health struggles and an inability to maintain employment or contribute financially to the household, one section read. Petitioner has provided sole financial support for the duration of the marriage. Sole financial support. As if I hadn't worked for the first 7 years. As if I hadn't contributed my business income, my savings, my inheritance from my grandmother, all of which had flowed into accounts Daniel now controlled. Another section detailed his proposed division of assets, the house, to Daniel, the investment accounts, to Daniel, the vehicles, to Daniel, the business assets, to Daniel. To me, nothing. Or rather, reasonable spousal support for a limited period to allow respondent time to establish independent living arrangements. Translation, he'd give me just enough to disappear quietly. The final paragraph was almost insulting in its paternalism. Petitioner remains concerned for respondents' well-being and hopes this process can proceed amicably for the benefit of both parties. concerned for my well-being. The man who had systematically stripped me of every resource was concerned for my well-being. I should have felt panic, rage, despair. Instead, I felt something close to satisfaction, because Daniel had just made his biggest mistake. He had stepped into the light too soon. I called the lawyer Monica had recommended, a woman named Patricia Voss, who had a reputation for being relentless. Our first meeting had been 3 days earlier, in her downtown office. She was in her mid-50s, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. I'd laid out everything: the documents, the timeline, the transfers, the forged authorizations. Patricia had read through it all in silence, her expression neutral. When she finished, she looked up at me. "This is good work," she said. "Very thorough." "Is it enough?" "More than enough." She leaned back in her chair. "Claire, what your husband has done is textbook financial abuse, possibly fraud, depending on how we frame it. You have documentation of asset concealment, misrepresentation, unauthorized use of your signature for transactions you didn't consent to. Can we prove that? That I didn't consent? We can establish a pattern. The emails where he deliberately mislabeled documents, the transfers that don't match his stated purposes, the accounts opened in his name only despite your signature, and most importantly, she tapped the Stephen Dale email thread, his correspondence with a financial consultant about moving joint assets without your knowledge. I felt something unclench in my chest. What happens now? Patricia had smiled, a sharp, professional smile. Now we wait for him to make his move, and when he does, we respond. Now, sitting in my bungalow with his divorce petition in front of me, I called her again. "He filed," I said when she answered. "I saw. The court copied me this morning." She paused. "How are you feeling?" "Honestly, relieved. He's showing his hand." "That's exactly the right way to think about it." I heard papers rustling. "His petition is aggressive. He's claiming sole financial contribution, emotional instability on your part, and requesting virtually all marital assets." "Can he do that?" "He can request it. The court won't grant it." Her voice was firm, confident. "Especially not once we file our response." "When do we do that?" "You have 30 days to respond, but I'd like to file within 2 weeks. Strike while his claims are still fresh and demonstrably false." "What do we need?" "Nothing. You've already given me everything. I'm drafting the response now, along with a motion to freeze all marital assets pending investigation." My heart jumped. "Can we do that?" "Given the evidence of asset concealment and potential fraud? Absolutely." Daniel called that evening. I almost didn't answer, but something, curiosity maybe, or the desire to hear his voice now that I knew exactly what he'd done, made me pick up. "Claire." His voice was calm, measured, the same tone he'd always used. "I assume you received the papers." "I did. I want you to know this isn't personal. It's just time. We've both known this hasn't been working for a while." I said nothing. He continued, filling the silence. "I've tried to be fair. The support I'm offering should give you time to get back on your feet. Find a job, maybe reconnect with some of your old clients. Start fresh." Start fresh, with nothing, while he kept everything. "I hope we can handle this maturely," he said. "No drama, no fighting, just a clean separation." "Okay," I said quietly. He seemed surprised by my compliance. "Okay?" "Yes, I'll review everything with a lawyer and respond appropriately." A pause. "You hired a lawyer?" "Of course. That's standard procedure, isn't it?" Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear him recalculating. "Right, of course. That's smart." His voice had changed slightly, still calm, but with an edge of something else. Concern, maybe, or the first whisper of doubt. "Was there anything else?" I asked. No. I just wanted to make sure you were okay, that you understood this is for the best." "I understand perfectly," I said. And I did. I understood that Daniel thought he'd cornered me, that he believed his petition, with its claims of my instability and dependence, would force me to accept whatever scraps he offered, rather than fight a public battle I couldn't win. He had no idea what was coming. "Take care of yourself, Claire," he said, and hung up. 2 weeks later, Patricia filed our response. I didn't read it beforehand. I trusted her, but she sent me a copy after it was submitted to the court. It was 37 pages long. The first section dismantled Daniel's claims of sole financial support, documenting my income contributions, my business earnings, and the inheritance money I'd contributed to our joint accounts. The second section detailed the pattern of financial control and isolation, complete with email evidence and transaction records. The third section, the one that made my hands shake when I read it, outlined the asset concealment. Every suspicious transfer, every misleading authorization, every discrepancy between what Daniel had claimed and what had actually happened, and attached as exhibits, copies of everything, the Stephen Dale emails, the deed with my forged consent, the investment accounts opened in his name using my signature, the refinance that had extracted $47,000 in equity with no accounting. The final paragraph was simple and devastating. Respondent requests a full forensic accounting of all marital assets, an immediate freeze on all accounts pending investigation, and appropriate legal action regarding potential fraud and unauthorized use of respondent's identity in financial transactions. Patricia called me an hour after filing. "It's done," she said. "The court will review our motion to freeze assets within 48 hours. I expect approval." And then? Then Daniel's accounts get locked, every single one, and he has to provide documentation for every transaction we've questioned. I closed my eyes, letting it sink in. "Claire?" Patricia's voice softened slightly. "How are you doing?" "I'm okay," I said, and I meant it. Because for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't reacting. I wasn't defending. I wasn't begging. I was acting, and Daniel had no idea what had just hit him. The court froze Daniel's accounts on a Tuesday morning. Patricia called me at 9:47 a.m. to deliver the news. "Motion granted," she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. Every account, every investment vehicle, every asset we identified, frozen pending full disclosure and forensic review. I was sitting on the bungalow's front porch, coffee going cold in my hands, looking out at the overgrown yard I'd been slowly reclaiming. "How long until he finds out?" I asked. "He probably already knows. The bank would have notified him immediately when they received the court order." I imagined Daniel trying to access his account, the confusion, then the anger, then the slow, creeping realization that I hadn't simply accepted his terms. "What happens next?" I asked. "He has 14 days to provide complete financial documentation. And Claire?" Patricia paused. "He's going to call you." "I know. Don't engage. Anything he says can and will be used. Forward any communication directly to me." "I will." But I knew Daniel wouldn't call. He would come. He appeared 3 days later. I was in the front yard, pulling weeds from the neglected flower beds, when I heard the engine. That specific engine sound I'd learned to recognize over 12 years. The low purr of his silver sedan. My hands stilled in the dirt. The car slowed as it approached, then came to a complete stop at the edge of the property. I didn't stand up, didn't turn around, just kept my hands in the soil, pulling at stubborn roots, breathing steadily. I heard the car door open. "Claire." His voice, sharp, strained, nothing like the calm, controlled tone he'd used on the phone. I sat back on my heels and turned to look at him. Daniel stood beside his car, one hand still on the open door, as if he wasn't sure whether to approach or flee. He looked different than I remembered, thinner, somehow, or maybe just diminished. "What are you doing?" he asked. I glanced down at my dirt-covered hands, then back at him. "Gardening." "You know what I mean." He took a step forward, and I saw his jaw tighten. "The court order, the asset freeze, the accusations, the evidence," I corrected quietly. He stopped. "What?" "Not accusations. Evidence." His face flushed. "Claire, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is insane. You can't freeze everything. I have bills, responsibilities, business obligations." "So do I," I said. "I had bills too, remember? When you cut off my access and left me with nothing? That was temporary. I was trying to help you. By committing fraud?" I stood up, brushing dirt from my jeans. "By moving joint assets into your name without my knowledge? By using my signature on documents you deliberately mislabeled?" His expression shifted, confusion giving way to something harder. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I have the emails, Daniel. The ones between you and Stephen Dale, the asset restructuring consultation, the strategy for moving $85,000 in joint funds into protected accounts." The color drained from his face. For 12 years, I had watched Daniel maintain perfect control in every situation. I had seen him navigate conflicts, business negotiations, family disputes, always calm, always 3 steps ahead, always unshakable. This was the first time I'd ever seen him look afraid. "Those were private communications," he said, his voice low, "about our joint assets, which makes them relevant." I crossed my arms. "You should probably talk to your lawyer." Daniel stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to recalibrate, trying to find the angle, the approach, the words that would put him back in control. "This doesn't have to be ugly," he said finally, his tone shifting to something softer. "We can work this out. I'll restore your account access. We can sit down, talk through everything." "No." The word came out firm, final. His eyes widened slightly. "Claire, no," I repeated. "We're not talking. We're not negotiating. This goes through the lawyers now, through the court, through proper channels where everything is documented and nothing gets explained away." "You're making a mistake." His voice hardened again. "You think you can win this? You think some lawyer is going to—" "I think 12 years of financial records will speak for themselves," I interrupted. "I think a paper trail of forged authorizations and concealed assets will be very clear to a judge, and I think you underestimated me." That last sentence hung in the air between us. Daniel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a second, I thought he might actually yell, might finally lose that iron control he'd maintained for so long. But he didn't. Instead, he looked past me, toward the house. His eyes scanned the property, the porch I'd repaired, the yard I'd cleared, the survey stakes that had been placed 3 days ago by the county assessor. His gaze locked on those stakes. "What are those?" he asked slowly. "Survey markers." "Why are there survey markers on this property?" I felt something close to a smile pulling at my lips, but I kept my expression neutral. The property needed to be assessed. For what? For rezoning approval and sale. His face went absolutely still. "What are you talking about? This property isn't—" He stopped. Understanding dawned slowly, painfully. You can't sell this. It's not yours. Actually, I said calmly, it is. You transferred it into my name in 2019 for tax purposes, remember? You had me sign the paperwork, told me it was just a formality. I watched him realize his mistake. The bungalow he'd relocated me to, the place he'd sent me to decay in isolation, had been transferred into my name years ago as part of one of his tax strategies. A minor property, insignificant, something he'd forgotten about in his larger calculations, except it wasn't insignificant anymore. The land had been quietly rezoned 6 months ago. I discovered it during my research. The area was being developed, property values had tripled, and because Daniel had put it in my name, it was legally mine. The developer made an offer last week, I continued. A good one, well above market value. Daniel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. So thank you, I said quietly, for the gift. We stood there in silence, him beside his expensive car, me in my dirt-stained jeans, a gulf of more than just distance between us. This was the moment I'd imagined 100 times, the confrontation, the reckoning, but I'd always pictured myself angry, shouting, finally releasing 12 years of suppressed rage. Instead, I felt nothing but calm. Cold, clear, unshakable calm. Daniel seemed to sense it, that shift in me, that fundamental change he couldn't manipulate or control. You've made a serious mistake, he said finally, his voice tight. No, Daniel, I replied. I made a mistake 12 years ago. I'm correcting it now. He got back in his car without another word. I watched him sit there for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Then the engine started, and he pulled away slowly, as if leaving required more effort than he could muster. I stood in the yard until his car disappeared completely. Then I looked down at my hands, still covered in dirt, still strong, still capable, and went back to my gardening. Because this wasn't about him anymore. This was about rebuilding, and I had work to do. The hearing took place on a cold morning in November. In a courtroom that smelled like floor polish and old paper, I arrived 30 minutes early with Patricia, wearing a navy dress I'd bought from a thrift store and the only pair of professional shoes I still owned. Patricia had told me appearance mattered, not expensive, just competent, put together, credible. You look perfect, she said, as we walked up the courthouse steps. Calm, professional, exactly what we want the judge to see. Inside, we sat at the respondents' table and waited. Daniel arrived 15 minutes later with his attorney, a man named Richard Sterling, who had a reputation for being aggressive. Daniel wore a tailored suit, crisp white shirt, silk tie. He looked every inch the successful businessman. He didn't look at me, not once. The judge was a woman in her early 60s named Margaret Winters. She had sharp eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had seen every trick in the book. We're here for the motion regarding asset freeze and discovery in the matter of Carver v. Carver, she said, settling into her chair. Mr. Sterling, you're representing the petitioner? Yes, Your Honor. And Ms. Voss for the respondent? Yes, Your Honor. Judge Winters opened the file in front of her. I've reviewed the initial filings. Mr. Sterling, your client filed for divorce with claims of sole financial contribution and requested full allocation of marital assets to the petitioner. Ms. Voss, your client responded with allegations of financial abuse, asset concealment, and potential fraud. That about sum it up? Yes, Your Honor, they said in unison. All right. Mr. Sterling, you requested this hearing to challenge the asset freeze. Let's hear your argument." Richard Sterling stood, radiating confidence. "Your Honor, the asset freeze imposed on my client is excessive and unjustified. Mr. Carver has been the sole income earner and financial manager of this marriage for years. The respondent ceased working at her own discretion and has contributed nothing financially to the household since 2019. I felt Patricia's hand briefly touch my arm, a silent reminder to stay calm. Sterling continued, "The allegations of fraud are baseless and appear to be retaliatory tactics designed to complicate what should be a straightforward dissolution. My client has provided complete transparency regarding all marital assets and—" "Complete transparency?" Patricia interrupted, standing. "Your Honor, if I may." Judge Winters nodded. "Go ahead, Ms. Voss." Patricia opened her folder. "Your Honor, we have documented evidence of systematic asset concealment spanning 5 years, financial transfers totaling over $127,000 that were either mislabeled, redirected, or hidden entirely from the respondent." She approached the bench and handed a packet to the judge, then one to Sterling. Exhibit A shows a refinance withdrawal of $47,000 in 2019 that never appeared in any joint account. Exhibit B documents investment accounts opened in Mr. Carver's name alone, despite requiring Mrs. Carver's signature, which was obtained under false pretenses. Exhibit C, she paused for emphasis, is email correspondence between Mr. Carver and a financial consultant explicitly discussing strategies to move joint assets into protected accounts without the respondent's knowledge. The courtroom went very quiet. Judge Winters read through the exhibit slowly, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up at Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, did your client disclose these transfers in his initial financial declaration?" Sterling glanced at Daniel, who sat rigid in his chair. "Your Honor, my client managed the finances and made investment decisions he believed were in the best interest of—" "That's not what I asked," Judge Winters said sharply. "I asked if he disclosed these specific transfers in his declaration." A pause. "Not in full detail, Your Honor." "Not in full detail." The judge looked back down at the documents. "It appears he didn't disclose them at all." Patricia remained standing. "Your Honor, we're not just talking about poor record-keeping. We're talking about deliberate concealment." Mrs. Pesadas, Carver's signature appears on multiple documents that were presented to her as routine paperwork. Tax forms, estate documents, account updates, when in reality they were authorizations for transfers that exclusively benefited Mr. Carver. She pulled out another document. This deed transfer, for example. Mr. Carver told Mrs. Carver she was signing tax documents for an inheritance. Instead, she was signing off on a family trust that listed only Mr. Carver as trustee and beneficiary. Judge Winters looked directly at Daniel for the first time. "Mr. Carver, did you tell your wife she was signing tax documents when she was actually signing a trust deed?" Daniel's lawyer started to answer, but the judge held up her hand. "I'm asking your client, counselor." Daniel stood slowly. His voice, when it came, was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I simplified the explanation, Your Honor. I didn't want to confuse her with technical details." "Simplified?" Judge Winters leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Carver, obtaining someone's signature through misrepresentation is fraud. You understand that?" Daniel's face went pale. "I wasn't trying to. It wasn't my intention to." "Sit down," the judge said, not unkindly, but firmly. The hearing lasted another 40 minutes. Patricia presented document after document. The Stephen Dale emails, the unexplained withdrawals, the accounts that contradicted Daniel's sworn statements about our finances. With each piece of evidence, I watched Daniel's attorney deflate a little more. He tried to argue that these were standard financial management decisions, that married couples handle money differently, that there was no malicious intent. But the paper trail was undeniable, and Judge Winters wasn't buying it. Finally, the judge closed the file and looked at both attorneys. "Here's what I see," she said. "I see a clear pattern of financial control and concealment. I see signatures obtained through misrepresentation. I see assets systematically moved without proper disclosure. And I see a petitioner who filed for divorce claiming sole financial contribution while hiding over $127,000 in transfers." She turned to Sterling. "Your motion to lift the asset freeze is denied. In fact, I'm expanding it. Every account, every property, every asset acquired during this marriage remains frozen until we have a complete forensic accounting." Sterling opened his mouth to object, but the judge continued. "Furthermore, I'm ordering Mr. Carver to provide full documentation, bank statements, tax returns, investment records, everything, going back 7 years. And I'm appointing an independent forensic accountant to review it all." She looked at Daniel directly. "Mr. Carver, I suggest you cooperate fully, because if this investigation reveals what these documents suggest, we're not just talking about asset division. We're talking about potential criminal charges." The hearing ended. Patricia gathered her documents while I sat very still, trying to process what had just happened. We'd won. Not completely, not yet, but we'd won this round, and it mattered. As we stood to leave, I finally looked at Daniel. He was still sitting at his table, shoulders slumped, staring at nothing. His lawyer was packing up quickly, already distancing himself from what was clearly becoming a losing case. Daniel must have felt my gaze because he looked up. Our eyes met across the courtroom. I saw fear there, and anger, and something else, disbelief maybe, as if he still couldn't quite understand how this had happened, how the woman he'd controlled so completely had somehow slipped free. I didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't say a word. I just held his gaze for 3 seconds, then turned and walked out. Outside the courthouse, Patricia put a hand on my shoulder. "You okay?" I took a deep breath of cold November air. "Yeah, I am." "That was a good ruling. Better than I expected." "What happens now?" "Now?" Patricia smiled. "Now Daniel has to explain every dollar he moved, and when he can't, and he won't be able to, the court will make him pay it back. With interest." I nodded slowly, letting it all sink in. 12 years of control. 12 years of manipulation, all of it about to be exposed in black and white, with legal consequences Daniel couldn't smooth talk his way out of. "Come on," Patricia said. "I'll buy you coffee. We have a lot to discuss about next steps." As we walked down the courthouse steps, I realized something. I hadn't cried, hadn't shaken, hadn't felt anything but calm, clear certainty, because the truth had spoken for itself, and it was louder than any voice Daniel had ever tried to silence. The final settlement came through on a gray afternoon in March, 6 months after that first hearing. Patricia called while I was unpacking boxes in my new apartment, a modest 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a renovated building downtown. Nothing fancy, but it had good light, hardwood floors, and most importantly, it was mine. "It's done," she said. "The judge signed off this morning." I set down the box I was holding and sat on the edge of my new couch, purchased with my own money, from my own account, with no one's permission but my own. "Tell me," I said. Full accounting was completed. The forensic audit confirmed everything we alleged. Daniel concealed $142,000 in transfers over 6 years. The court ordered him to return your half, $71,000, plus penalties and interest. Total comes to just under $89,000. I closed my eyes. $89,000. Not everything I'd lost, not the years or the trust or the version of myself I'd given away piece by piece, but enough to rebuild. "There's more," Patricia continued. "The property sale went through. Your share after taxes and fees is $67,000. And the court granted you 40% of his retirement accounts and investment portfolios. Total settlement value, approximately $240,000. My breath caught. $240,000, more than I'd earned in the last 5 years combined. "Claire?" Patricia's voice softened. "You still there?" "Yeah," I managed. "I'm here." "You did this. You know that, right? You built the case. You found the evidence. You had the courage to fight back when most people would have just walked away with nothing." "I had a good lawyer," I said. She laughed. "You had good instincts. I just presented them." After we hung up, I sat in the silence of my new apartment for a long time. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, standing in that grocery store, humiliated, card declining, walking out with empty hands and her head down. I thought about the bungalow, the isolation, the nights I'd lain awake wondering if I'd ever feel whole again. I thought about Daniel's face when he realized I hadn't broken, when he understood finally that control only works on people who don't know they have choices. And I thought about this moment, sitting in my own space, financially independent, legally free, with a future I got to design myself. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like breathing after being underwater for 12 years. I finished unpacking that evening. Books on shelves I'd assembled myself, dishes in cabinets I'd chosen, art on walls that reflected my taste, not compromise. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went for a run, not because I had to walk 3 miles to get somewhere, not because I had no car and no choice, because I wanted to. I ran through the downtown streets as the city woke up around me, my lungs burning, my legs remembering how it felt to move with purpose and power. When I got back to my apartment, sweaty and exhausted and alive, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back looked different. Older, yes. Thinner than she used to be. Lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. But also clear-eyed, strong, present. I recognized her. She was the woman I'd been at 31, before I'd learned to make herself smaller, before I'd mistaken control for care. She'd been there all along, just buried. And now she was back. I relaunched my consulting business in April, not with fanfare or grand announcements. Just a simple website, a few calls to old contacts, a LinkedIn profile I updated with steady hands. Within 2 weeks, I had 3 clients. Within 2 months, I had 8. The work came back easily, like muscle memory. Records management, document organization, system implementations. The skills I'd thought I'd lost were still there, just waiting to be used again. Monica met me for lunch one afternoon, sliding into the booth across from me with a huge smile. "Look at you," she said. "You're glowing." "I'm exhausted," I corrected, but I was smiling too. "Same thing." She ordered coffee and leaned forward. "Seriously, Claire, I'm so proud of you. What you did, what you survived, most people couldn't have done that. I didn't have a choice. You had lots of choices. You could have given up. could have accepted whatever scraps he offered, could have believed what he told you about yourself. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. But you didn't. You fought back. I looked down at our joined hands. I just didn't want to disappear. Well, you didn't. You're more here than you've been in years. I ran into Daniel once, 3 months after the settlement. It was accidental. A coffee shop near the courthouse where I was meeting a client. He was sitting at a corner table, alone, staring at his laptop with the hollowed-out expression of someone going through motions. He looked up as I walked past. Our eyes met. I waited for something. Anger, fear, satisfaction. Some echo of the 12 years we'd spent together. But I felt nothing. Not hatred, not triumph, not even pity. Just nothing. He was a stranger. Someone I used to know. Someone who no longer had any claim on my thoughts or my energy. I nodded once, a simple acknowledgement of shared history, and kept walking. He didn't follow. People ask me sometimes how I survived it, how I found the strength to fight back when everything had been taken from me. The truth is, I didn't find strength. I remembered it. It had always been there, beneath the layers of compliance and self-doubt and learned helplessness, beneath the years of being told I was too emotional, too unstable, too dependent. Strength doesn't announce itself with shouting or drama. It doesn't require an audience or applause. Sometimes strength is just standing up from that armchair, opening the pantry, and deciding you're going to survive another day. Sometimes it's refusing to make the call you're expected to make. Sometimes it's sitting in a bungalow with $43 in your pocket and choosing to rebuild instead of beg. Sometimes it's the quiet, unglamorous work of gathering evidence, making spreadsheets. Documenting truth. A year after the settlement, I bought a small house. Nothing extravagant. 2 bedrooms, a modest yard, a porch where I could drink morning coffee and watch the neighborhood wake up. The first night I slept there, in my own bed, in my own house, under my own roof, I lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds. The creak of floorboards settling, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, normal sounds, safe sounds, sounds that belonged to a life I'd built myself. And for the first time in 13 years, I fell asleep without a single knot of anxiety in my chest. There's a photograph on my mantel now. It's from the day I closed on the house, me standing on the front porch, holding the keys, smiling not for the camera, but for myself. I look at it sometimes when I need reminding, not of what I survived, but of what I became. If you're reading this and you see yourself in my story, if you recognize the slow erosion, the careful control, the voice that tells you you're not enough without them, I want you to know something. You are enough. You always were. The person trying to convince you otherwise is lying. And the moment you realize that, truly realize it, everything changes. Not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly, steadily, inevitably. Because the most powerful moment isn't revenge. It's not the confrontation or the courtroom victory or the settlement check. The most powerful moment is when you look in the mirror and recognize yourself again. When you remember who you were before someone tried to rewrite you. When you understand that freedom doesn't scream, it just is. I still live in that house. I still run my business. I still see Monica for lunch and work too many hours and forget to buy groceries sometimes. I'm not perfect. I'm not healed in some complete movie-ending way, but I'm free, and that's everything. Thanks for listening to the end. Please kindly tell me in the comment section the state you are watching from. Also like and subscribe. See you in the next video.